also nervous, and therefore they will also sort of not remember how to do things that they generally know how to do pretty well.
And also, technology glitches. The other day, I had a supervision with one of my DPhil students, and I couldn't schedule a Teams meeting. It said you can't schedule a private meeting, and I actually had to reinstall Teams. And I was doing this kind of in the small hours of Monday morning because I just didn't want to let my student down. But I also wrote to her saying, I don't know what to do. You can't get IT help over the weekend, and Teams had glitched. So it's just
I also had a Teams glitch yesterday. Maybe it was something to do with Teams. Right, we are being joined by seminar participants. I'll just wait a few more moments before we kick off. And I introduce Dorothee, our speaker today.
It's hard to believe it's already week 6, Dorothea.
It is. I mean, that said, I'm not teaching this term, so I feel like I have like a long term from September to December, which is quite enjoyable compared with the sort of 8-week frenzy that many colleagues are going through at the moment. So I am enjoying that.
Okay, I think it's a good time, 4 or 5 minutes in, to make a start. Hi, everyone. Very, very warm welcome to all participants to the 3rd meeting this term of the Postcolonial Writing and Theory Seminar. As many of you know, my name is Elike Burma, and co-convener on this seminar with me is my colleague Anki Mukherjee, and we both profess world literature and postcolonial literature here in the English faculty. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Dorothee Boulanger to give us a paper this evening, a paper that has had something of a COVID checkered history. Dorothee, I think we began talking about hosting you back in March 2020, and it's so delightful to be able to welcome you at last. In the medium of Zoom, it is true, but we're all kind of used to that now. And through the help of Torch, we have been so helped by Zoom in this COVID pandemic period. To introduce Dorothee, just over to her, Dorothee Boulanger is a JRF at Jesus College here in Oxford, and she is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. After training in international relations and gender studies, she completed a PhD in history at King's College London, analysing Angolan post-independence fiction as historical sources. So working very much at the crossroads between historical and literary frameworks. Dorothee's research lies at that crossroads with a specific interest, though, in Lusophone Africa, gender and masculinity, and the legacies of revolutions and socialism in Africa today. And it's from that research, Dorothee, that you are presenting this evening. Dorothee is currently working on a project entitled Contemporary Griots, Writing the Revolution in Africa, comparing 4 writers from Algeria, Angola, Congo, and Zimbabwe. So a multilingual as well as a multiliterary project. And it's from that research that you will speak today. Thank you so much, Dorothee, for joining us. You're very welcome to the Postcolonial Seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elike. Thank you, Anki, for welcoming me. I think we started talking about this even in 2019.
We did.
So I'm very, very happy to be with you tonight. Thanks to everyone for joining us as well. I will start sharing my screen. It might take a minute before the PowerPoint comes up fully, so bear with me. Okay, so Tonight, I want to talk about memories of socialism in Angolan art and literature. I called my paper Unmasking Violence, Writing Nostalgia, because I will be looking at a novel and I will be looking at an art installation as well. So before I introduce the two works that I will be looking at, I just wanted to make a few quick points about where my research is located, and also a few sort of temporality points that I think are relevant. So the first point is that there has been a very strong interest in the Cold War and in thinking about the Cold War through the Third World, through questions of non-alignment and revolution recently. And that has been a great entry for Lusophone Africa in post-colonial studies, but also a re-entry in post-colonial studies and in global studies generally, because Lusophone Africa has played such a big part in the articulation of Cold War dynamics and Third World and non-aligned questions. So I've very simply framed these issues because we need to rethink about how the Cold War is articulated to the Third World. So is the socialist bloc different from the Third World? What has been the role of the Soviet Union with non-aligned countries, and how are revolution understood in the Third World and in the socialist bloc? This is also in the wider context of studies that think about a non-alignment and a revolutionary internationalism as an emanation of the Black Atlantic, as a continuation of political and intellectual networks dating back from the Atlantic slave trade. Recent works by Monica Popescu, Nadine Siegert, and Delinda Collier have also focused on the kind of intellectual and artistic dimensions of the Cold War, showing how ideas and texts have also shaped collective identity, memory, and created cultural archives in what can be called the global South or the developing world, depending on the sort of framework. So how we articulate revolution and socialism, how we think about the porous boundaries between these two concepts, is something that I want to look at through Angolan texts and through Angolan voices tonight. The additional remarks that I want to make that are more specifically about my presentation and about the works we'll be looking at tonight have to do with the moment of publication or creation of these works. So the novel we'll be looking at, which is a novel by Pepetela, I'll go back to in a second, planalto, estepe, was published in 2009. So that is 7 years after the end of the Cold War in Angola, and almost 20 years of the civil war in Angola, which lasted from 1975, when the country became independent, to 2002, and almost 20 years after the end of the Cold War. Similarly, the art installation we'll be looking at was created in 2017. So both works are very much looking back on the socialist period, looking back at the 70s and the 80s. Another sort of temporality that matters is that Pepetela is a writer that was born in the early 40s, so he is part of that nationalist generation of Angolan writers who took part in the anti-colonial struggle. Pepetela himself was a guerrilla and a guerrilla instructor, whereas Kiluanji Kia Henda, who is the artist who created the art installation, was born in 79, so it's from a later generation. So how these two generations look back on socialism is also something that I'm interested in showing you. So the first work is O Planalto e a Estepe, that it hasn't been translated in English. You can translate it, the title, by The Highlands and the Steppe. It was written by Pepetela, which is the nom de plume of Arturo Pestana, who is an Angolan writer. He is one of the most iconic Angolan writers. He is a major writer. He received the Premio Camões in 1997, which is the highest literary prize in the Lusophone speaking world. And he has been publishing for over 40 years. He was also very close to the post-colonial and to the anti-colonial movement and the post-colonial regime. So he also has this kind of insider's look onto post-colonial Angola. The novel itself is a relatively short novel. Pepetela says that it is the story of one of his friends that he promised he would write, but he only did so after his friend passed away. And it's a kind of a revolutionary internationalist Romeo and Juliet taking place in Moscow at the People's Friendship University. So it tells the story of Julio, a white Angolan from southern Angola, who goes to study there after fleeing the draft in Portugal. It's a love story between Julio and Sarangerel, who is a Mongolian student, but also the daughter of the Mongolian Minister of Defense. They fall in love, but Sarangerel's family absolutely refuses that she be in a relationship with an Angolan student. And when Sarangerel becomes pregnant, her father organizes her kidnapping back to Ulaanbaatar. And then basically the couple is separated. And despite Julio's frantic attempts at finding Sarangerel, they are separated for almost 40 years. They eventually reunite after the end of the civil war in Angola, so in the year 2000s, in Cuba, which Julio visits after learning that Sarangerel lives there as the wife of the Mongolian ambassador. So that is the plot of O Planalto e a Estepe, and I'll go back to some aspects. One element that I want to mention is that the title, O Planalto e a Estepe, is very similar to Abderrahmane Sissako's documentary title, Host of Luanda, where he also revisited these connections between the Soviet Union and Africa. So the kind of emphasis on geography and different places is something that that is important, that I'll go back to. And the plot of O Planalto e a Estepe is also reminiscent of a short movie by Abderrahmane Sissako called Octobre. It is also about a sort of forbidden love story between an African student and a Russian female student. So that was the novel. The second piece I want to look at is an art installation. It's an art installation by the Angolan artist Kiluanji Kia Henda. You see his picture here. He is much younger than Pepetela. He was born in 1979, and in 2017 he was the recipient of the Frieze Artist Award, and therefore he was able to do an exhibition in the Frieze Gallery in London. And his art installation draws a parallel between witchcraft and Marxism in Angola. You can see some of the elements. I will go back to, when I talk more about the piece, I will go back to each element. And what Kiluanji Kia Henda was saying about his work, and the translation is mine, is despite being a political doctrine that rejected religion, the way that Marxism-Leninism was indoctrinated during the revolution demanded strict loyalty and unquestionable belief, similar to religious practice. In this project, the bust of Lenin returns to become the central object of an installation and performance piece, where the memories and narratives of one of the bloodiest conflicts in Africa are molten with the transcendence of witchcraft and the dogmatic dimension of a political ideology. So what you see very clearly here is art, history, religion, and politics kind of brought together. And so the way in which these two pieces dialogue with one another, the way in which they share or don't share perspectives on the socialist period is basically what I want to be looking at with you tonight. So the idea is to examine the memories not only of socialism in Angola, but also of internationalist solidarity and revolutionary geographies. And that is happening after 2002, after peace came to Angola, at a moment when the Angolan state is sort of in complete denial, if you want, in a state of amnesia regarding that kind of revolutionary past. There is no real mention about Marxism. There is no real mention about any kind of revolution going on. The MPLA, which is the anti-colonial revolutionary party that took control of the state in 1975 at the moment of independence, is still in place in 2002, still in place today in 2021. So there is the same party, but now advocating a completely different form of ideology. It is supposed to be multi-party politics in Angola, which is obviously quite relative. But the state has also been very happy to sort of abandon Marxism for a form of ultra-liberalism carried by the prices of oil and diamonds. So the moment when Pepetela publishes o planalto e a estepe and goes back, revisits that past of international solidarity, revolutionary utopia, is a moment when in Angola these conversations have absolutely no sort of official or institutional bearing, and very much left unspoken, when not vehemently denied by the ruling elites. One of the things that I will look at as well in the ways in which the novel and the art installation talk about socialism and what it has been for the Angolan people is in its legacies of violence, and particularly the legacy of the year 1977, when 18 months after the Angolan independence, a failed coup attempt unleashed a very strong state repression. I'll go back to that in detail, but this kind of thinking about when the Angolan revolution ends, basically, is one of the questions that I want to ask in my presentation. And finally, of course, it is about thinking about what kind of aesthetic operations both the novelist and the artist create to remember socialism. In Pepetela, it's O planalto e a estepe is a very poetic text, emphasizing the beauty of Angolan landscapes, describing a kind of flawless love story. So there is something very romantic that obviously echoes the revolutionary ethos that was driving the nationalists in the 50s and 60s. So you have a sort of parallel here between Julio and Sarangero and the kind of love story between socialism and the third world. And we'll see that it's a very different atmosphere in Kiluanji Kia Henda's work, which tries to provoke emotions such as fascination, fear, and anxiety. So as I just mentioned, the story of Julio and Sarangero has a lot to do with the story that united the third world in Angola with socialism. What's interesting, for example, is the ways in which in the novel, so I'll go first through the novel and then through the art installation, and we'll make some final remarks at the end. One of the major aspects in which revolution is portrayed through the character of Julio in O planalto e a estepe is through the question of travel and movement. Julio is constantly on the move, giving his trajectory, his journey, the kind of initiation flavor that has to do with almost a kind of epic narrative. So he is born, as he explains, in the beautiful south of Angola, which is a landscape of highlands. There is very low population concentration. So Julio comes from a sort of tiny colonial nucleus of white, poor Portuguese immigrants in the south of Angola. And the kind of mediocrity and smallness of that social environment contrasts with the wonderful landscapes of Angola and the richness of his Angolan friends and of his Angolan friendships. And Julio leaves the south of Angola to go study in Portugal. There he escapes the draft and manages to flee to Morocco, from Morocco. He wants to fight for the MPLA in the anti-colonial war, but because he is white, he is told that it's better if he goes study, because at this early stage of the anti-colonial war, they can't have white people leading Black men in the battle. So he accepts and he goes to Moscow to study. He will then go to Belarus when he's finished studying for more military training. Then he goes to Algeria. From Algeria, he'll try to reunite with Saranjero, and so he will fly to Mongolia. That will fail. He'll go back to Algeria and then finally go to Angola to fight in Angola's anti-colonial and then civil war. And it's only after he's retired that he finds Saranjero during a trip to Cuba. So Giulio, in that sense, embodies the kind of revolutionary ethos, and it reminds me, and it contrasts with the Soviet bloc. So when Giulio goes to the Soviet Union, goes to Moscow, he is struck, he is immediately taken aback by the lethargy of the socialist state, by the bureaucracy, by the absence of any kind of dynamic, by the ways in which people are silent and don't talk about important things. When Saranjero is kidnapped by her father, so forcibly removed, and we'll go back to that later, but you see here the kind of gender difference between the young nationalist man who goes from one country to the other, and the woman who is not free to move from one place to the other, but on the contrary is actually forced to return home. I'll go back to that gendered aspect a bit later on. But when Saranjero is kidnapped, Giulio tries to kind of get the support of the Soviet institutions, try to have them do something to allow him to be reunited with Saranjero, or at least visit Mongolia to see her and plead with her father. That never happened. Giulio talks about, and again, translation is mine, about the socialist countries of the Soviet bloc as the perfect polished world of silences. And of course, Giulio is the opposite of that. So there is here immediately a sort of questioning of socialist orthodoxy, the idea that, contrarily to these ideas that socialism was kind of genuine and real in the Soviet Union and in its immediate neighbors, whereas African socialisms were never really something authentic or important. It seems here that Giulio embodies socialist and revolutionary virtues much more than the Soviet state. And this kind of reminds me of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's point in Pen Points and Gun Points, where he says that the artist and the state are always at war with one another because the artist is movement, is creation, is revolution, whereas the state is order and lethargy and immobility. So there very much is that kind of dichotomy taking place in Pepetela's narrative. And even after the Angolan independence, and even after the end of the civil war in Angola, Giulio still believes in these kind of revolutionary principles. He still embodies a form of ethics. He is said to be very honest. He's not trying to establish a secure position within the Angolan state for himself. He doesn't loot, he doesn't get rich. And he sees the kind of regime's turn to capitalism with a lot of bitterness. He perceives this as a defeat, almost a personal defeat. So the novel, in that sense, is very much a love declaration to Marxism in itself, not the Marxism of the Soviet Union or of the socialist bloc, but the kind of Marxist utopia, if you want, that Angolan nationalists truly believed in at the time. And in portraying that kind of dichotomy between the Soviet Union that was in the end supporting the Angolans, but also very much behaving as an imperial power and favoring geopolitical aspects over ethical considerations, in that kind of dichotomy, Pepetela, through the story of Julio, also pays a very strong homage to some of Angola's major allies in the non-aligned world. Algeria, for example, and at some point Julio says, talking about Algeria after Boumedienne's coup, so when Algeria was already kind of stirring away from the revolution in the mid-60s, he says, dead the mystique of a socialist popular revolution. What remained was solidarity towards the people fighting for independence in Africa. Algeria never failed in that respect. We benefited from that. And he says we benefited from that, talking obviously about the support that Algeria gave to Angola and particularly to the MPLA during the anti-colonial war, but he's also talking much more personally about the fact that Algeria accepts to give Julio a fake Algerian passport so that he can go to Mongolia and try to be reunited with Sarangero. So here again, you see the fate of Julio being sort of conflated with the fate of the Angolan revolution and being prevented by the kind of orthodoxy and conservatism of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. He also mentions grandes cambas argelinos. So camba is a Bakongo word for camaradas, so comrades, mentioning that kind of brotherhood that the Algerians and the Angolans shared, having both been through awful anti-colonial warfare. He also mentions the influence of Algeria, and again does that at a moment when Algeria itself is not at all reclaiming that kind of legacy, but also but rather embodying another form of lethargy under Bouteflika. And right alongside Algeria is Cuba. Cuba during the Angolan civil war was absolutely key to the socialist or to the MPLA and to the socialist regime in Angola. Cuba sent over 400,000 people in Angola between 75 and 91, soldiers, but also doctors, teachers, civil servants, engineers. Cuba was absolutely decisive in its support of the MPLA. And so when Julio goes to Cuba to find Sarangero, he says that one of the first things he feels when he arrives there is that he had arrived. So again, this sense of reconnecting with the revolution, reconnecting with a genuine ideology of emancipation and solidarity happens on the Cuban soil. He says, Cuba never betrayed me. This island truly brought me luck. And again, we don't really know with Julio talking about himself and the opportunity to be reunited with Sarangero, or if he's talking about Cuba's support to the Angolan revolution and its loyalty to President Neto, who was the first president of Angola. So while Julio is sort of remembering these solidarities and relations of friendship and I think I could say brotherhood, we also see a critique of Soviet patriarchy. So to some extent, the ways in which Sarangero is prevented from going with the man she loves and having to be submissive towards her father is of course a very gendered script. And through the eyes of Julio, the conflict very much looks like a conflict between junior masculinity and senior masculinity. At the end of the day, o planalto e o estepe very much centers, and that is kind of a recurring trope in Pepetela's literature, very much centers on male conflictuality and erases women's agency. At the same time, it also erases the racism and sexism within MPLA nationalism. Margarida Paredes investigated that question. She was herself a guerrilla fighter for the MPLA and has very close contacts with the MPLA and women who fought for the MPLA. And many of them who were studying abroad actually remembered when they were abroad being prevented by their Angolan comrades from dating, falling in love with foreigners. So whereas in planalto e estepe, it looks like the sexism and racism is only coming from the sort of Soviet Mongolian side, the testimonies of Angolan women is that that kind of patriarchal unequal relationships was very much replicated within the MPLA itself, and that is entirely erased from the novel. So the question of the control over women is displaced, but it is displaced through a complete erasure of women's agency and a centering of male voices and male experiences, which at the end ends up kind of replicating unequal power relations. And the question of control and surveillance that I just mentioned is absolutely central, even beyond gender relations, in the work of Kiluanji Kia Henda, his art installation called Under the Silent Eye of Lenin. I'll go back in a second to that title. So I just want to describe it very quickly. So it's in one room with a dominant colors of red, black, and yellow, which seem to echo the Angolan flag. There is one wall that is covered with pictures of what we understand to be Soviet and or Cuban soldiers, and inscriptions in Russian, celebrating the Russian army, celebrating the Communist Party, calling for workers to unite and fight, etc. So revolutionary slogans that are also sort of pastiche and collage, because some of them are from the 20s and 30s, actually celebrating Stalin, while clearly the pictures date more from the 60s and 70s. So there is some form of collage going on here. And similarly, the art installation is also articulated around a replica of a bust of Lenin. So there are 3 busts. I'm showing you the first 2 here. The first one on the left is actually located in front of a TV that is showing the making of these statues on a bed of black feathers, which are a sort of sign of bad omen in many African societies, including the Bakongo. And on the right, you see another bust that is sort of trapped in concrete with a bleeding red star. So immediately, the kind of immobility that Pepetela located in his novel on the Soviet side is replicated here, but with stronger echoes to the situation in Angola and to the intervention of the Soviet Union in Angola. But the most spectacular aspect of the installation is this bust, which takes the form of a Congo power object called Nkizi Nkondo. I'll go back to in a second, but basically what it is a statue that is entirely pierced with nails. Its head is the same head that is on the other Lenin bust. So it's the head of Lenin on a Congo statue covered in nails. And of course, in the back, you see elements from the Soviet emblem. And you see the kind of very powerful emotions that are coming out of this power object, the fascination, the awe. And by the way, the black veil is not at all a Congo object. So that looks much more like a kind of a black Catholic veil. So again, sort of weaving together Catholicism, African witchcraft, and Soviet symbols to convey the sacralization, but also the fear that came with socialism and Marxism in Angola. So then Kizinkondi is a very important power object in Bakongo society. I just wanted to show you a few other examples so that you see the kind of real objects that this one, which is a fake replica, are to see the real statues that inspired the fake replica with the Lenin head. Then Nkondi, so Nkondi in Bakongo means hunter, which means that these power objects, which are mostly containers, so if you look at the shapes on their bellies, they're containers of forces, are created to pursue evil doers. So, which means that they are created to pursue witches. They are activated by healers, and it's a composite process, very much as the art installation itself. You need to have someone who is initiated and who says the right things as it activates the statue by hammering it, by hammering a nail into it, and therefore provoking its wrath, so that it has the power to then inflict harm on the evildoer. So the appearance is supposed to be suggesting these sort of remarkable, powerful qualities of the statue. They're containers as well. So it kind of asks the question, what was Marxism the container of? Is Marxism, Leninism just an empty signifier that is used to legitimate or justify the struggle or the discrimination of certain people? In any case, the ways in which a curse is supposed to be working is by binding, tying. And again, here we have references to sort of immobility, preventing movement, that I find interesting across both the novel and the art installation. Wyatt McGaffey, who is an anthropologist, who is a specialist of these statues and of the Bakongo people, says it is difficult to exaggerate the violence of the images comprised in invocations to Nkondi. So we really here have an object that is supposed to be destructive, that is supposed to inflict harm, again, on people who are themselves guilty of committing harm. At the same time, there was also a predatory function, because the people who were identified as witches, so would be identified as witches because they would be ill or something would happen to them, and it was considered a result of the activation of one of these power objects. These people had then to pay for the healer, so it had to pay compensation. So people who could invest in these statues were also getting rich from it. And the reason I say this is because you see how power is invested in these kind of spiritual forces, but also has a very sort of materialistic, financial, if you want, dimension to it. The last element I wanted to mention in terms of thinking about the kind of collage and hybridity of these objects is that one of the theories about the nails in these statues is that they might be from a certain interpretation of the crucifixion. So there might be a Christian element to it that has been reappropriated by Bakongo society in the early colonial period. So the reason I mention these elements and the reason why this statue is so powerful is because in Bakongo society, witchcraft is understood to be a deadly force in interpersonal relations. And I want to take this seriously as an analytical frame. What is Kiluanji Kia Henda doing when he is placing witchcraft at the heart of Marxist performance? What is it trying to say? And a major aspect of witchcraft, a major aspect through which witchcraft is performed, but also feared and sort of present in people's minds, is through issues of suspicion, accusation, and expiation. So the question of suspicion and of being accused of being a witch is a very strong control mechanism in many African societies. And this is what seems to be hinted at here with the kind of terrifying white eyes of Lenin. What we see is an invisible power that sees us and that controls us and that will chastise, punish us if we do not behave. The association between Marxism and witchcraft is not new, however, and in the 80s, Aikwe Arma actually denounced this. He said that, so in an article called Masks and Marx, he said that Marx had become a kind of ceremonial ancestor, an icon or an ancestral mentor surrogate for intellectuals, for African intellectuals who were ignorant of their own intellectual traditions. So for Arma, Marx was actually a mask that was used by the postcolonial elite to gain power and talk about emancipation, but still abiding by Western frameworks. So there seems to be a quite close connection here in the mobilization, Kiluanji Kia Henda's work, in the mobilization of African witchcraft and the kind of modernity, progress, and emancipation that Marxism promised. However, in Angola, the question of witchcraft and modernity is a very complicated one, because the MPLA, which was one of 3 anti-colonial movements in Angola, was a modernist Marxist party and considered witchcraft as something that was inherently backwards, pre-modern, and is something that was considered to have to be abandoned with independence. And the other nationalist parties or anti-colonial parties in Angola, such as UNITA or the FNLA, denounced the MPLA for being completely cut off from its African culture and its African origins. So for the MPLA, this nationalist movement turned Marxist ruling party, witchcraft was very much an objection that was a figure of objection located in the Angolan other, so the backward African rural that hadn't yet embraced modernity, but would so if the MPLA took power. The MPLA advocated for the creation of the new man, o homem novo, the new man that was supposed to be emancipated from all these superstitions and traditions. And so by locating witchcraft at the heart of Marxism, by fusing Lenin and Kizinkondi, if you want, Kiluanji Kia Henda is very much sort of talking back to that modernist discourse of the MPLA, is very much showing the hypocrisy, but also questioning the ways in which power is exercised in post-colonial Angola and pointing at internal repression. And one of the major events that we think about when we think about internal repression is the repression that followed the failed coup attempt of the 27th of May, 1977. I don't want to go into too much detail on this. I don't have a lot of time left, but basically a leftist dissident faction from the MPLA tried to seize power on the 27th of May, and they shot a dozen of MPLA officials in the process. The coup failed. And then the Angolan state and its president, Agostinho Neto, unleashed a wave of repression that is thought to have killed tens of thousands of people in Luanda and in the cities. And it was very much the sort of culmination of a repression against leftist movements by the leftist party that had started in 1975 when the MPLA seized power. And the newspaper extracts that I show here just show the kind of violence of the official propaganda after the coup, calling for people to be tied. So amarem-nos is really tie them. So again, this idea of binding, catching, immobilizing people, and above calling for them to be shot and saying that they will pay for their crimes. So an extremely violent dimension. And this echoes, and at the a few months after the coup, so 6 months after the coup, to sort of put an end to dissidence within the MPLA and sort of bring back discipline within the party, the MPLA became a sort of official Marxist-Leninist single party, and Angola became a single party Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. And under the silent eye of Lenin, which is the title of Kiluanji Kia Henda's art installation, is a quote from a speech by the Angolan president, Agostinho Neto, during that first official congress of the MPLA, turned MPLA Workers' Party, Partido do Trabalho, as they became a single party dictatorship. And Agostinho Neto was saying, we are now, proclaiming this new regime under the silent eye of Lenin. And this picture is a picture of Agostinho Neto on the left, with his closest advisor, Lucio Lara, on the right, and in the middle, the Minister of Defense, Ico Carrera. So all three men considered to be most involved in the repression that would only end in 1979 after the intervention of the Organization of African Unity. So what I'm trying to say here is that this picture is not in the art installation. It's not one of the pictures on the wall. It's nowhere. However, it was on Kiluanji Kia Henda's Facebook page in the middle of his pictures about his exhibition. And he said that the discourse that he took his title from was the discourse that Agostinho Neto made in the speech that he made in 1975 at the moment of the proclamation of Angolan independence, which is incorrect. It wasn't in 75. Sob o olhar silencioso de Lenin is what Neto said in 77. So it looks that even the artist is sort of muddying the water here, trying not to put too much emphasis on the coup attempt and its repression, but still sort of leaving elements, a trail, if you want, of elements to actually draw our attention to it. So a very ambivalent aspect here. And this ambivalence is also found in the two processes of curation and canonization of these two works. I'm almost finished, by the way. I'll be just a couple of minutes. It's interesting how this work was done in 2017. So this art installation was done in 2017, which is a moment when the Angolan regime was becoming much more repressive, and when the period of euphoria that started in 2002, when peace came to Angola, and where oil prices were able to drive reconstruction in Angola, that sort of collapsed after 2012-13 or 11, and the collapse of oil prices, and suddenly there was much more discontent in within the Angolan population, and much more repression. So the fact that Kiluanji Kia Henda, who has done works that were much more utopian and future-facing and optimistic in the years before that, sort of turned to this extremely dark and bleak remembering of the socialist period, seems to also hint to the kind of tightening and fossilization of the Angolan regime especially after 2014. So there is this kind of much more critical moment after a more optimistic one. At the same time, there's also a playful instrumentalization of African artifacts. And I can't go into any details about this, but it's really interesting how the use of a fake Nkondi object creating the kind of awe and fear and fascination that it would have created in the 19th century when it was used as a power object is also a way to sort of instrumentalize a certain, exotic, strange, scary Africa, tainted, if you want, by witchcraft. So there is some ambivalence here, a certain exoticization of witchcraft, if you want. But at the same time, there's also a double otherness in bringing both the figure of Lenin and the figure of Nkizi Nkondi within an art gallery in London, and therefore replicating the kind of religious experience from Marxism, from witchcraft, within what is often considered as the kind of new temples or churches in the West, which are art galleries. So you really have this sense of an experience of sacralization and cult that is experienced by various agents, including the audience of the exhibition. So these are just a few remarks on the curation, and at the same time, of course, the insertion of Kiluanji Kia Henda in a sort of highly capitalist, globalized art scene that also speaks back to global forces. So just to conclude very briefly, in Pepetela's text, we have a sort of celebration of the individual hero, a kind of tragic figure trying to deal with an arbitrary law. And in Kiluanji Kia Henda's art installation, you have the sort of representation of that arbitrary social order, of witchcraft holding society together by instilling fear, but also creating cycles, if you want, of punishment and collective healing. So power is ambivalently located between the national level, Angola and the MPLA, and the global forces such as the Soviet Union and Marxism more generally. And finally, the last words of the novel, when Julio, who is now deceased and is a spirit sort of roaming through the Angolan planalto, he says that he doesn't really want to travel anymore to the Pacific, to Mongolia, that he only wants to look at the highlands, and o sul da minha vida, the south of my life, seems again to sort of locate hope within a kind of global south that also replicates the Angolan south. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dorothea. If you don't mind removing the PowerPoint, then we can again see each other. Thank you. That's a remarkable and very formidable, piece of work on African literary and cultural studies. And we already have two wonderful questions that have been put in the Q&A box. So I'm going to read you the first one. It's from Kathy Hazra. And it says, apart from denouncing the danger of Soviet nationalist socialist regimes' influence in Angola, was Kiluanji Kia Henda's installation also envisioning a new kind of democratic regime or not?
This installation, I wouldn't think so. He has done many things that are much more dynamic and future-facing and hopeful, putting people on planks that were where colonial statues were removed, for example. So he has this kind of much more optimistic, future-facing art. But this one is notable for that kind of absence, I find, of light and hope. I find it extremely dark and bleak. So I think he was very much making a point here and contrasting with the rest of his work.
Thank you. We have another question, which is, witchcraft is witchcraft. This is from Jude Nwabuke. Witchcraft is witchcraft. Marxism is Marxism. Making a parallel between the two concepts seems to give Marxism some kind of mystic outlook rather than an intellectual ideology that was embraced by many African intellectuals like a borrowed cloth that never fits. And that aside, I love the transnational scope of your analysis.
Well, I think a bit like witchcraft, Marxism is very much what people make of it. And so I think what we see here is actually an African artist giving his own interpretation of, again, what Leninism or Marxism-Leninism has been, or what it has meant for his country, very much keeping in mind there is no ambiguity as to the fact that it was just a very convenient varnish, a very convenient mask for extremely repressive and conservative forces to unleash on Angola. I mentioned that Congress in '77 that was supposed to transform the MPLA into a Marxist-Leninist orthodox single party. It was all the opposite. I mean, the only criteria to be a part of the party was to be loyal to the president and had nothing to do with any kind of political ideology. So it is that kind of plasticity, I would say, of Marxism and how it was appropriated by certain elites that has to be kept in mind here. Exactly in the same way that witchcraft here is appropriated by Kiluanji Kia Henda, who is an artist who has been raised in an environment that is very westernized and cosmopolitan, and probably doesn't have an Kisingondi in his living room.
There aren't any new questions at the moment.
Anki, I have a question
Sure, please go
that
ahead.
I've been
Please
burning
go
to
ahead.
ask. Well,
Could I just
whether
say
it's
one more thing? Alika, could I just say one more thing? I can see a raised hand. Because this is being recorded, I'm afraid we can't really let anyone speak without taking written permission. So please type your question in the Q&A box. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Alika, but
no
people are
worries,
raising
no
hands.
worries.
So
This is a very open-ended comment stroke question, Dorothy, and thank you for your really eye-opening paper. That really is what my question is about, the way in which your paper opened, I mean, a very different world of, if you know, Lusophone writing of revolution and post-colonial experience in parts of the world that global Anglophone writing or Anglophone post-colonial writing doesn't really doesn't really investigate. I mean, I noted that interesting moment when you cited Ngugi and brought some of his thoughts from pen points and gun points into your debate. So I suppose my question is something like, what is the world that these texts inhabit, do you think? I mean, I notice, and art installations. What is the, what are the traditions of exchange and critique? I mean, obviously Marxist critique, but I noticed such an interesting other world opening up through your paper. And I'm reminded of some of the work that I've done on Nelson Mandela, his biography, and noticed that certainly Pepetela was tracing out a very similar network to the network that Mandela explored in the late 50s and 60s when he was forging solidarities and connections across the African continent with Algeria, with Angola, and of course reaching out to Fidel Castro over in Cuba as well. So yeah, I suppose the question is, what is the nature, do you think, of this world that these works are engaging with?
That's a tough one, because I think actually
very tough.
I think the two works are actually engaging with very different worlds. And so I think the novel has this kind of, it's a live memory for Pepetela. These kinds of networks. These are people who fled Portugal, who were in Algeria, where they created, the culture, the Angolan Cultural Center. So it's a very embodied experience. But they also went through then the 70s, which was the late 70s, which was an absolutely awful time in Angola, and the 80s, when the country completely shut itself, including the 90s, actually, even after the Cold War, until the end of the Civil War. So the thing is, it's two completely different experiences. One that was for 15 years, the necessity to go abroad, because with the repression in Portugal and Angola and Mozambique, etc., you had to find that support abroad. But at the same time, the implications with being out of touch from your own population once you came back, but being so convinced that you were on the sort of right side of history, that the dialogue became extremely difficult, giving the legitimacy to the rival nationalist movements, who said that they were much more tuned with African realities. And I think that is a fact, especially for rural populations. So Pepetela has that kind of very disjointed trajectory, extremely internationalist, and he is considered by Mabe Kotali, who's like one of the best specialists of the MPLA, as one of the very few truly Marxist intellectuals of the MPLA. And then having this sort of 25 years of isolation within Angola. And Kiluanji Kia Henda comes from a completely different intellectual space, because he has been able to sort of latch on to the global art scene. He's been able, also to sort of develop as Angola was opening and as Angola was awash with money. And the contemporary art scene in Angola is very complicated. One of its biggest figures until he passed away accidentally a couple of years ago was the husband of Isabel dos Santos, who is the daughter of the former president, José Eduardo dos Santos. So the diamond and oil money was also feeding into this artistic world, which was at the same time being extremely critical and had a platform that literature would never have, literature in Portuguese would never have. But Kiluanji Kia Henda, with that kind of art installation, can have an echo and will make sense across the world. So I think the audiences are very different, but even the message is very different. And I think the ethos, if you want, is very different. And that's mostly a generational gap, because both are coming from a relatively urban, privileged Angolan environment.
Thanks so much. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Rachel, for putting your question in the box. And I'm really sorry, because of the format of this particular session, we can't really let people speak. I know it's very frustrating. I'll read the question out. I think there's some slippage in your presentation and maybe in the art exhibition between witchcraft, that is the illegitimate and dangerous use of spiritual power for personal gain, and belief in witchcraft as something that, for instance, needed Nkisi to help seek out and combat in order to safeguard society. Is the exhibition exploring that slippage in when violence use of spiritual force is legitimate?
Give me a second here. Yes, so yes, basically you're right, Rachel. So the idea, if you want, is that Nkisi Nkondi is made to pursue witches. So it's not witchcraft in itself, but would be more considered a spiritual force, ancestral force, etc., aimed at targeting witches. And witchcraft is considered to be the illegitimate use of these spiritual forces. So to some extent, yes, the installation doesn't present it this way. And I think there is a reason for that, which is that the understanding of witchcraft and of spiritual forces or the invisible will be very much that all of this is kind of the same thing. And it is true that today in Angola, people talk about feitiço, witchcraft, in different ways. So, you know, we might consider that the term is it's sort of illegitimate and vague, but that's actually how it is referred to. So there is slippage, but at the same time, there is this idea that a very powerful ideology of emancipation and equality was completely turned on its head to justify a single party made of quite conservative elements of society holding on to power. So in that sense, the idea of witchcraft and Marxism as kind of like empty signifiers, but just being used to produce a certain awe, if you want, a certain shock in the audience, is what is happening, what the artist is trying to bring forward here. If that makes sense.
I had a quick question, and this is while kind of much more informed and specialist questions are lined up. Once again, thank you very much for the presentation. I want to go back to the Pepetela novel and ask you, Dorothea, about some of the binaries you set up in that literary reading, where you were talking about Julio always on the move, and that distinction between art and state that the novel in particular mobilized. You identified revolution and movement on one side and order and lethargy on the other. And I wondered if you could talk a little more about the form of the novel. How does it do this? How does it also, because so much of it is about MPLA, you spoke a little bit about gender rights, but what about human rights? One of the things that the rise of the novel has been so sort of intricately involved with. How does this particular novel in a way become that sort of a kind of a space for exploring rights discourse?
I'm not sure. To some extent, that's a very tricky one, because I think to some extent the novel is about very individual rights, in the sense of who you can marry, who you can have a family with, etc. So there is a sort of very basic individual dimension to it that, for Giulio and for the other students who are supporting him, goes with the idea of socialist liberation and emancipation, is at the heart of it. And what we constantly see are larger logics, and the logics of the state favoring, privileging other priorities, including geopolitical connections, etc. And the thing is, Giulio is very much a heroic figure. So Giulio has, and again, this is Pepetela writing about one of his friends who passed away. So Giulio has no flaws. He is a kind of hero in that sense, that he is both the kind of romantic, tragic hero, but he is also, this kind of intersects with mythical heroes who created the new Angola, who fought for the new Angola. And that leaves very little space for the kind of complex individual figures that Pepetela develops in other novels, but here he's doing something different. And what he's doing, I think, is first a kind of celebration of his friend, and who seemed to represent everything that he believed in at some point, but also trying to, as I say, kind of resuscitate and inscribe in the Angolan canon, and Pepetela being who he is, and particularly in 2008, any publication of him is something that will remain in the kind of Angolan canon, inscribing that kind of third world internationalist logic within the Angolan canon and within Angolan history. So human rights are never mentioned. He does not talk about the 27th of May. And Pepetela never talks about the 27th of May because he was implicated in interrogating suspects afterwards, because he never denounced the violence of the state at that point. So he is completely stuck in that sense. And I think it's like he doesn't want to derail his narrative, which is about his friend, and go into those kind of dirty subjects. So I think there is, in that sense, a sort of a bit asepticized discourse, if you want, about it, but also something that has to do with his very tricky position in some of the most controversial and worst episodes of Angola's post-colonial history.
Thank you. There's another question. This is from Robert Freeman. And he says, thanks for a rich and interesting talk. Just to add to the discussions on witchcraft, John Lee Anderson's biography of Che Guevara spends a lot of time describing Guevara's anger at the time and energy spent on witchcraft before and after battles while he was fighting in the Congo. Anderson points out that this wasn't out of a rejection of African mythologies, but instead because he thought to see spiritual forces as static and not responsive to modern realities was an insulting and detrimental way to approach them. Perhaps helpful for some of your thoughts on movement versus stasis in Cold War context in Africa?
Yes, definitely. I mean, actually, in Planalto e Estepe, Giulio mentions that when he finally gets to go fight in Angola, and he quite quickly becomes a sort of commander, his soldiers at first don't obey him, don't follow him, because he hasn't been initiated, and therefore he has not been protected by a healer, by Nganga. And so they don't want to, they don't trust him. And he tells, and so one night he gathers them around him and tells them of the night he was initiated, and he makes it up entirely, but just does that to just show that he shares that kind of preoccupation. Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, Che Guevara's experience in the Congo, I think, was frustrating on more than one aspect. But I think it's just, it also shows the kind of dead ends of the very modernist, forward-thinking subjects who didn't really connect with rural population, with traditional beliefs in African societies, and therefore ended up replicating in many ways the kind of Western dichotomies between tradition and modernity, backward and forward, that already existed during colonialism. So it's not very surprising that Che Guevara felt like that, and felt like that particularly regarding witchcraft. Yeah, but yes, it's a good one.
Another question. As Alika said, they start sort of gathering momentum as the session carries on. So this is from Penny Cartwright. Would it be possible to talk a little more about the conflict between junior and senior masculinities, as you mentioned in the novel, in relation to witchcraft, if you think relevant? Age-based power structures are another oft-cited feature of African cultural systems, with witchcraft sometimes evoked in relation to intergenerational conflicts, thinking of the Komarov's discussion of voodoo capitalism and intergenerational antagonism in South Africa.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And absolutely, I think, so there are two dimensions, I think, in Angola that are relevant to that point. The anti-colonial movement, and I'm talking here about the MPLA. So the MPLA being this kind of multiracial, urban, Marxist, anti-colonial movement that was eventually victorious, managed to gain independence, and has never given up on power ever since. They were engaged in a battle against senior masculinities on two fronts. One of them was the kind of African traditional senior masculinity. It's interesting in Pepetela's novels, much earlier novels, and other writers, how they talk about African chiefs as being corrupt, as being the auxiliaries of colonialism, and their abysmal treatment of women, and that's blocking access to younger women, etc., etc. So there is that aspect, a very strong distrust in African senior masculinities and African chiefs. But there is also a distrust in Portuguese senior masculinities. And here we are talking about a generation that grew up under Salazar. So that grew up under a colonial regime that was itself fossilized, dictatorial, and extremely gendered. And the leaders of the MPLA were very much, the sons of a certain social group that was conservative. You had many people whose parents were Portuguese and, pro-Salazar. So I think in a novel by José Eduardo Agualusa, he has a character saying, the FNLA and UNITA say that the MPLA is just the sons of the colonizers fighting to basically strip their fathers from power in Angola. And actually, I think that's the best definition there is. So there really is this sense of, yes, this is what's happening. It is the same sort of colonial nucleus, but that is then taking power, a younger generation that is just raising against their fathers, but doesn't have more respect or more connection for African masculinities either. It's the Homem Novo, again, like the new men, and they were supposed to embody this, and that's why they left no place for women either.
Wonderful. I think Alika has a quick question. I don't see any new ones.
I just had a thought that was actually sparked by Penny Cartwright's question just then about masculinities, and also the thread that was running through your introduction, through your bio, Dorothée, about gender. And you mentioned Margarida Paredes, I think, And here you have a member of if you like the senior generation of revolutionary figures, and then you have somebody from the the younger cosmopolitan generation, both obviously male artists. It's a curiosity really what are women artists and writers, how are they responding to some of these questions of nostalgia, history, Marxism, magic?
That's a tricky one. In terms of literature, clearly the overrepresentation of men is baffling in Angola. In the founding members of the Union of Angolan Writers, you have maybe 15, 20 writers. You have one woman, and she is the wife of the president, Agostinho Neto. So it's an extremely male and conservative environment. You have some women who have written one novel, and you had several women who were poets during the anti-colonial struggle. But it's, especially if you compare with Mozambique, like the underrepresentation of women is striking, is very strong. Then you have a new generation of women. They're mostly singers. I can't think of many plasticians, but art is not necessarily my forte. So it is still very male dominated, definitely. One of the women writers, Paula Tavares, has been critical of Pepetela's gender bias, because it kind of runs through his work, and has raised attention to that. But I mean, the work of Margarida Paredes in that instance, in that way of showing how it's been systematic that the MPLA and then the Angolan state has erased women's voices and women's experiences from national narratives. It is one of the first works to really draw attention to that. And it says a lot about how little power women have occupied, although the MPLA presented itself as very progressive and in favor of women's emancipation, but in the end, just trying to basically channel women's energies and not really paying any attention to women's rights or women's voices.
Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, we have in the chat, we have Andrew Stewart Thompson saying, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Elke, is there anything else we need to announce right now?
We will follow up very shortly with clarity on the final seminar of the term. Anki, as you know, we're planning some exciting events for next term. But again, watch this space. We'll send out notices soon.
So then it remains for me to thank Dorothea. Thank you so much for being so patient with this presentation. We have really been looking forward very much to it, and this was very rich. It has given me so many ideas, and I'm definitely going to order the book right away. So thank you very much. Please come back, and thank you everyone for attending in this very dark and also very tired week of the Michaelmas term. Hopefully we will see you, if not in week 8, but early next term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Dorothea. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Perfect.
Excellent.
There we go.
Thank you so much, Nikki.